K9 dog didn't recognize his veteran. The shocking ending. No one expected. Jack Reynolds stared at the photo on his mantle, his fingers tracing the edge of the worn frame. Rex's eyes, sharp, amber, and full of life, stared back at him, mouth open in what looked like a grin. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat glistened under the sun in that picture, taken the day before their last mission. Jack's own face was younger then, unlined by grief and guilt, his arms slung around Rex's neck in a way that spoke of absolute trust. That trust was shattered 2 years ago, in the dusty chaos of a foreign desert, when an IED exploded, flipping their convoy and scattering debris across the sand. In the confusion, amid the screams and gunfire, Rex bolted. Jack had called for him until his throat was raw, stumbling through smoke and blood. But Rex was gone, swallowed by the desert without a trace. Since then, Jack had come home to a house that was too quiet, to nights that stretched endlessly, broken only by dreams of Rex's eyes wide with fear. The VA therapist had suggested he get a new dog. Jack had ignored the advice, refusing to fill the void with a stranger's face and unfamiliar eyes. But today, standing alone in his living room, Jack felt the walls closing in, the silence pressing against his chest. He scrubbed a hand over his face, rough with days-old stubble, and checked the time. His sister Lisa would be here soon. She had insisted, no, demanded, he come with her to the new animal shelter outside of town. Just to look, she'd said, her tone bright and unrelenting. Jack wanted to cancel, to make an excuse about the headache creeping behind his eyes. But the thought of Lisa's disappointment was worse. She'd been through enough already, watching him fall apart since coming back home. The rumble of Lisa's Jeep broke through the silence, tires crunching on gravel. Jack took a breath, steeling himself, and opened the door just as she raised her fist to knock. "Well, you look like hell," Lisa said, but her eyes were soft. "You ready?" Jack shrugged into his coat, avoiding her gaze. "Let's just get this over with." The drive was quiet, Lisa filling the silence with stories about her students and her neighbor's yappy Pomeranian, who tried to fight everything that moved. Jack grunted in the right places, eyes fixed on the fields blurring past the window, but his hands were fists in his lap. The shelter was a low brick building surrounded by pine trees, its sign freshly painted in bright blue letters. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Inside, the scent shifted to sawdust and antiseptic, underscored by the soft chorus of barking. Volunteers moved between kennels with leashes and bowls, offering smiles to visitors. Jack's gaze skittered over cages and two bright eyes, over wagging tails and noses pressed to wire, and every step felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Lisa was already talking to a volunteer, a girl with a ponytail and a green vest. "My brother's a veteran," she was saying, voice warm and insistent. "He worked with German Shepherds overseas." The girl's eyes softened, and she gestured down a corridor. "We actually have a few shepherds. Follow me." Jack's boots felt heavy, scuffing against the tile. His breath shallowed as they passed rows of cages, but he forced himself to keep moving, to keep breathing. They stopped at a kennel near the end of the corridor. The girl unlocked it, stepping aside to let Jack approach. The dog inside was lying down, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded and distant. His coat was black and tan, the same as Rex's, but dull with neglect. Scars marred the fur around his shoulder, a rough line where a harness might have rubbed. Jack's chest went tight. The dog's eyes were amber but not bright, guarded, wary. His ears flicked at the sound of the latch, but he didn't move. The tag on the kennel read MAX in blocky letters. "He was found a few months ago," the volunteer said softly. "No chip, no collar. He's been difficult to place, doesn't trust easily." Jack's throat was dry. He crouched slowly, knees protesting, until he was eye level with the dog. "Rex," he whispered, the name escaping before he could stop it. The dog's eyes flickered, just for a second, and something like recognition sparked. But then Max's ears flattened, his lips drawing back in a silent warning. Jack's hand dropped to his side, numb with the sting of rejection. "Sorry," the volunteer murmured. "He's been through a lot. Some of the strays come in with trauma, you know?" Jack swallowed hard, his pulse loud in his ears. He was already shaking his head, stepping back, the walls narrowing around him. "Let's go," he muttered, voice rough. "I can't. He's not." Lisa's hand was warm on his arm, grounding. "Just think about it," she said gently. "Please." Jack barely remembered the drive home. The house felt colder than before, shadows stretching long across the floor. Rex's picture was still on the mantel, eyes bright with loyalty and trust that cut deeper than any wound. Jack sank onto the couch, hands in his hair, heart aching with the empty space that Rex had left behind. But every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Max, those amber eyes clouded with pain and distrust. All he heard was the soft growl, not angry, but scared. Jack stayed there for a long time, staring at the dark, breathing slow and shallow to hold back the grief rising like a tide. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, quiet and persistent, the way Max's ears had flicked, just once, at the sound of his name. The way his eyes had flickered, as if some part of Rex still lingered behind the walls. Jack scrubbed a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. He pushed to his feet, legs unsteady, and grabbed his keys before he could change his mind. The Jeep rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the dark as he turned back toward the shelter. His hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, his pulse a dull roar in his ears. But he didn't stop. Couldn't. Jack pulled into the empty lot, headlights catching the sign with its bright blue letters. The door creaked as he stepped inside. The lights dimmer now, most of the volunteers gone home. The girl at the desk blinked in surprise. "Back so soon?" she asked, voice gentle with understanding. Jack's throat was raw, but he forced the words out, each one dragging over barbed wire. "I'll take him," he said, voice breaking, "even if he doesn't remember me." The girl's eyes softened. She nodded, reaching for the clipboard. "It'll take a bit of paperwork," she said softly, "but you're doing a good thing." Jack's hands shook as he signed the forms, eyes fixed on the floor. It felt like tearing open an old wound, raw and bleeding, but he couldn't walk away. Not when there was a chance, no matter how small, that some part of Rex was still there, waiting. The girl disappeared down the hall, and Jack's breath hitched as he heard the soft click of the kennel door, the hesitant scrape of claws on tile. Then Max was there, ears back, eyes wary but watching. Jack went to one knee, every nerve frayed and raw. "Hey, boy," he whispered, voice splintering. "I've got you." Max's ears flicked just once, and though his eyes were still shadowed, he took a slow, cautious step forward. Jack gripped the leash tighter, the nylon biting into his palm as he eased the Jeep into the driveway. The headlights swept over the garage door, illuminating rust patches and chipped paint before flicking off, plunging everything into darkness. In the passenger seat, Max sat stiff and unmoving, eyes fixed straight ahead. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths, ears half-pinned. Jack's voice cracked the silence, low and hesitant. "We're home, bud," he murmured, but the words fell flat in the cold air, unanswered. Max's tail gave a single, uncertain thump against the seat, but his gaze never shifted, muscles still taut and braced as if for a blow. Jack's heart twisted at the sight, a fresh wave of guilt crashing hard and fast. It was a mistake, all of it, bringing Max home, thinking time alone might coax familiarity into his eyes. But now they were here, and Jack couldn't turn back, not with the way those amber eyes flickered, with something raw and broken beneath the fear. Steeling himself, Jack opened the door and stepped out, boots crunching over brittle leaves scattered across the driveway. The November air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and frost, biting at his cheeks as he rounded the Jeep. Max's ears twitched at the sound of the door opening, but he remained rigid, paws planted firm on the seat. Jack hesitated, knuckles white around the leash, before reaching in slowly, palm up and open. "Come on, boy," he coaxed, voice rough. Max's eyes flicked to his hand, pupils dilating, but he didn't move. For a heartbeat, Jack considered lifting him out, wrapping arms around that familiar shape, like he had 1,000 times before. Before the mission, before the sand and the gunfire, and Rex's shadow disappearing in a swirl of smoke. But he stayed still, holding his breath, waiting. Max's nostrils flared once, twice before he inched forward, each step deliberate and wary. When his paws hit the driveway, his legs trembled, nails skittering over concrete, but he followed when Jack tugged gently on the leash. Small victories, Jack reminded himself, swallowing down the ache in his throat. Inside, the house was dark and cold, shadows pooling thick in corners. Jack fumbled for the light switch, throwing dim yellow light across the kitchen tiles and over the photos on the walls, most in uniform, some faded at the edges but untouched since Rex's disappearance. Max halted on the threshold, ears swiveling and nose twitching, muscles bunching beneath his coarse fur. His eyes darted to every corner, pupils wide and black. Jack kept the leash slack, voice low and even. "It's all right," he soothed. "Just me and you." But Max's eyes lingered on the hall, where a photo hung crooked. Jack and Rex, nose to nose in desert fatigues, sun glaring off sand and Rex's teeth bared in a panting grin. Jack's breath stuttered. Max flinched at the sound, paused backpedaling a step, and Jack bit back a curse, guilt clawing up sharp and sudden. "Easy," he whispered, sinking slowly to one knee. "You're safe here, I promise." The words felt empty, but Max hesitated, eyes flicking back to Jack's face, wary but curious. After a moment, his ears dipped slightly, and he crept forward, nails clicking softly over tile. Relief flooded through Jack's chest, and he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He guided Max into the living room, where blankets lay folded on the couch, and the space smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. Max sniffed cautiously at the corners, gaze darting to Jack every few seconds, a question in the tilt of his head. Jack eased down onto the worn recliner, letting the leash slip loose. His hands trembled, fingers numb with cold and something deeper, but he kept his voice steady. "This is home now," he murmured, "for both of us." Max circled once, twice, before lowering himself cautiously onto the rug. His eyes never left Jack's, unblinking and glassy, but his chin dipped to rest on crossed paws. Jack watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his ears flicked at the smallest sound, the hum of the fridge, the groan of floorboards. Exhaustion pulled at Jack's limbs, but he stayed where he was, eyes heavy but unwilling to close, terrified that if he looked away, Max would disappear like a shadow in fog. Minutes bled into hours, the clock ticking steady in the silence. Jack's eyes burned, lids drooping, but he forced himself upright, shoulders stiff with tension. "I'm gonna get some water," he rasped, pushing to his feet. Max's head jerked up, eyes wide and dark, muscles tensing beneath his coat. Jack froze mid-step, breath catching at the panic flaring in those amber eyes, the white flash of teeth as Max's lips twitched back instinctively. "It's okay," Jack soothed, hands raised, heart pounding in his ears. "Just water, bud." "Stay." The command was instinctive, a reflex from years of training, and the second it slipped past his lips, Jack regretted it, guilt flaring hot and raw. But Max's ears flicked, and to Jack's shock, he stayed. His eyes tracked Jack's every move, but his paws remained rooted to the rug, body low and tense but obedient. Jack's throat tightened, a breath hitching past cracked lips. Maybe, just maybe, some part of Rex was still there, buried beneath the trauma and confusion, waiting. Clutching that sliver of hope, Jack filled a bowl with water and set it down slowly, careful not to move too fast. Max's nose twitched, eyes narrowing at the offering, but after a heartbeat of hesitation, he edged forward. The first tentative lap of water was soft, barely audible, but Jack's chest eased, breath trembling with relief. Max drank slowly, eyes flicking to Jack between each cautious sip, and for a moment the room was still, the only sound the soft lap of water and the muffled hum of wind against window panes. Jack's eyes burned, and he scrubbed a hand over his face, breath shuddering. "That's it, bud," he whispered, voice cracked and raw. "You're doing great." Max finished drinking, licking water from his nose, and sank back onto the rug with a soft huff. His eyes were heavy, lids fluttering, but he didn't look away from Jack. Didn't flinch when Jack's hand settled on the floor, fingers brushing softly over the edge of the rug. Jack's breath hitched, but he stayed still, letting the silence stretch, letting the trust build slow and steady, thread by fragile thread. And as the minutes passed, Max's eyes drifted closed, breath evening into soft, steady waves. Jack slumped back, exhaustion pulling at his limbs, but the ache in his chest was less sharp, the shadows less suffocating. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it would never be enough to fix what was broken. But for the first time in 2 years, Jack could breathe. Morning light seeped through the curtains, painting pale gold stripes across the living room floor. Jack stirred on the recliner, stiff neck protesting as he shifted, blinking groggily at the muted sunlight. For a moment, disoriented and heavy-limbed, he forgot where he was, forgot the empty bedroom down the hall, the silence pressing thick against the walls. Then the faint shuffle of paws over carpet pulled him back, and his gaze snapped to the rug by the couch. Max lay there, head lifted, ears pricked, and eyes already fixed on Jack, unblinking and guarded. His body was tense, muscles coiled beneath that familiar black and tan coat, but he hadn't bolted, hadn't retreated to a corner or flattened his ears. Just watched, waiting. Relief seeped into Jack's chest, unsteady but warm. "Hey, bud," he murmured, voice cracked from sleep. He shifted, wincing as pins and needles prickled up his legs. Max's ears flicked, eyes narrowing at the movement, but he didn't flinch away. Progress, Jack thought, his breath shuddering past dry lips. Slow, tentative, but progress all the same. The clock on the wall ticked steady and rhythmic, and Jack scrubbed a hand over his face, raking fingers through hair that was too long, uneven at the ends. His limbs ached with exhaustion, but he forced himself upright, boots scuffing against wood as he moved to the kitchen. The leash lay coiled on the counter, nylon frayed in places, and Jack's throat tightened at the sight. At the memories it dragged up, harsh and unrelenting. Rex bounding ahead on trails behind base, ears perked and eyes bright. Rex's weight leaning solid against his thigh during patrols. A steadying presence that anchored him when his breath hitched and sweat dripped cold down his spine. Jack swallowed hard, the kitchen blurring for a heartbeat before he blinked it back into focus. He reached for the leash with fingers that trembled, hesitating only a moment before turning to face Max. The German Shepherd hadn't moved, eyes tracking every step with a wary intensity, muscles still bunched beneath coarse fur. His ears flicked at the soft clink of metal as Jack uncoiled the leash, and his pupils dilated, amber swallowed by black. Jack's chest ached at the sight, but he forced himself to stay steady, voice low and calm. "What do you say, bud?" he rasped, holding out the leash. "Fresh air might do us both some good." Max's nostrils flared, sides heaving with quick, shallow breaths, but he didn't recoil, only watched with eyes dark and unreadable. Jack eased forward, each step slow and deliberate, pulse thundering loud in his ears. He crouched, the floor cool through worn denim, and stretched out a hand, palm up and open, leash draped loose across his fingers. Max's ears dipped, hesitation flickering over his face, but he leaned forward, nose twitching. Warm breath brushed Jack's knuckles, light as cobwebs, and Jack held himself still, muscles locked tight to stop the trembling. "That's it," he breathed, voice hoarse. "Good boy." After a moment's hesitation, Max shifted, inching forward until the cool metal of his collar brushed Jack's fingertips. Relief surged, raw and bittersweet, and Jack's hands steadied as he clipped the leash in place, fingers brushing coarse fur. The contact lasted only a second before Max jerked back, ears flattening, but the leash held, a fragile thread between them. Jack rose slowly, giving the leash a light tug. "Easy," he soothed, backing toward the door with careful steps. Max followed, stiff-legged and cautious, nails clicking over tile. His eyes never left Jack, wide and dark. But he didn't resist, didn't pull away. Small victories, Jack reminded himself, throat tight. It wasn't enough to ease the guilt twisting sharp in his gut, but it was something to cling to. The morning air was crisp and cold, stinging against Jack's cheeks as he stepped onto the porch. Frost glittered silver over the lawn, blades of grass stiff and brittle beneath a layer of ice. Max hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting to the trees lining the driveway, ears swiveling to catch the faint rustle of leaves. Jack stayed still, shoulders hunched against the chill, and let Max take his time. Finally, with a huff that was almost resigned, Max eased forward, paws brushing over frost-laden wood, nose twitching. Jack's chest loosened, the tightness easing with every step Max took away from the house, muscles relaxing by fractions. They moved slow, the leash slack between them, Jack's boots crunching softly over gravel, and Max's ears flicking at every distant noise. Birds trilling in branches, the creak of pine boughs under frost, a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the road. When they reached the edge of the yard, Jack paused, breath clouding white in the chill. Max stopped too, eyes cutting sideways, ears perked. For a long moment, they just stood there, frost crackling underfoot, breath misting in the air. Then cautiously, Max inched forward, nose to the ground, tail low but swaying slowly side to side. Jack's heart stuttered, a breath catching sharp and painful in his chest. He forced his hands to stay loose on the leash, fingers unclenching slowly. "That's it," he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. "Take your time, bud." Max's ears flicked back, catching the words, but he didn't tense, didn't freeze. Instead, he nosed through the grass, paws scuffing up frost, eyes flicking back to Jack every few seconds, watchful, uncertain, but not afraid. The sun hung low behind the pines, light bleeding gold through branches, warming the frost to slush. Max's coat glinted dully, black and tan, stark against winter's gray, and Jack's breath caught at the sight, at the way Max's tail swayed a little faster, ears perking fully for the first time. For a heartbeat, the yard blurred, pines melting into desert scrub and sun glinting off sand instead of ice, and Jack's fingers clenched white around the leash, heart pounding loud in his ears. "Rex!" he breathed, the name slipping past cracked lips unbidden, raw and aching. Max's ears twitched, head lifting, eyes cutting back to Jack. For a second, a breath, a heartbeat, something flickered behind those amber eyes, something bright and familiar, and so achingly close to recognition that Jack's vision swam, throat tight and burning. But then it was gone, shuttered behind fear and confusion, and Max's ears dipped, tail curling tight to his haunches. The ache came back sharp and sudden, hollowing Jack's chest with the force of it. His breath shuddered, a weak chuckle breaking past numb lips, and he forced a smile that felt splintered at the edges. "Yeah," he rasped, voice cracking. "Didn't think so." Max's ears flicked, eyes narrowing warily, but he took a step closer, leash pulling taut. His nose nudged Jack's knee, hesitant but warm, and Jack's breath hitched, eyes burning. For a heartbeat, he stayed frozen, muscles locked tight to keep from crumbling, hands trembling with the force of it. Then slowly, carefully, he sank to one knee, palm brushing over the coarse fur between Max's ears. Max flinched but didn't pull back, eyes wide and glassy. Jack's throat closed, words snagging and breaking. But he stayed there, fingers buried in thick fur, eyes squeezed shut to hold back the tears threatening to spill. "You're okay, bud," he choked out, voice fractured. "I've got you! I've got you!" The wind rustled through the pines, cold and biting, but Max stayed still, breath warm against Jack's neck, and for a moment, just a moment, the world stopped spinning. The rain started slow that night, a soft patter against the windows that built steadily into a downpour, drumming hard enough to drown out the creaks of the old house and the muffled hum of traffic on the distant highway. Jack leaned over the kitchen sink, fingers braced against the edge of the counter, eyes fixed on the dark smear of storm clouds through the glass. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and coffee gone stale, and the only light was the dull glow above the stove, casting shadows long and restless across the floor. In the living room, Max lay curled on the rug, ears twitching with every roll of thunder. His eyes were half-lidded, but never closed fully, muscles coiled tight beneath his coat, the leash still trailing loose from his collar, where Jack had forgotten to unclip it. Jack scrubbed a hand over his face, rough palm catching on stubble, and exhaled slow and shaky, the breath fogging faintly against the cold glass. It had been weeks since the shelter. Weeks of late-night pacing and early mornings spent coaxing Max from shadows with soft words and steady hands. Weeks of treading carefully around a silence that felt ready to splinter at the slightest wrong step. Jack's hand still trembled when he reached for the leash, still flinched when amber eyes flicked to his face and lingered there, dark and wary. The therapist had said it would take time, had leaned forward in her chair, eyes soft and steady, and reminded Jack that trauma wasn't something a few weeks could untangle. That Rex, no, Max, had seen things, had survived things, and that survival came at a cost. Jack had only nodded, jaw tight, words clumped heavy in his throat. Because how could he explain the way his heart cracked each time those familiar eyes darted away, wide and glassy, like a stranger staring back through a mask that didn't quite fit? A crack of thunder snapped him from the thought, sharp and sudden, rattling the windows in their frames. In the living room, Max jerked upright, ears flat and eyes wide, a soft growl rumbling low in his chest. His legs trembled, claws scrabbling against the rug as he scrambled back, haunches hitting the coffee table with a dull thud. Jack cursed under his breath, wiping damp palms over his jeans, and forced himself to move slow. Steps light across the kitchen tile. "Easy, bud," he rasped, voice hoarse. "It's just thunder. You're all right." But Max's eyes stayed wide, pupils blown dark and nostrils flaring, tail tucked tight to his belly. Jack's chest ached at the sight, a hollow, splintering kind of pain that made his breath catch. He knelt slowly, one knee popping with a dull crack, and stretched out a hand, palm up and open. "Hey, it's okay," he soothed, keeping his voice soft, even as his heart hammered loud in his ears. "I've got you." For a long moment, Max didn't move, sides heaving in quick, shallow breaths, eyes flicking to the door, the windows, anywhere but Jack's face. But then his ears dipped, muzzle lowering just slightly, and he crept forward, each step stiff and halting. Jack stayed still, fingers curling loosely against the rug, breath held tight in his chest. When Max's nose brushed his palm, warm and damp, something in Jack's chest unraveled all at once, breath shuddering past cracked lips. "That's it," he whispered, voice splintering at the edges. "Good boy." The rain drummed steady on the roof, a backdrop of white noise that smoothed the silence, softened the edges. Max shifted closer, eyes darting to the windows with every crack of thunder, but not pulling back. His breath warm against Jack's wrist, uneven and shaky. Jack's fingers twitched, aching to reach out, to bury themselves in coarse fur and hold tight until the trembling stopped. But he forced them still, forced his shoulders loose and voice steady, and just stayed there, knees digging into the rug, the leash a thin, fragile line between them. Max's ears flicked, head dipping to nudge at Jack's wrist, a soft, uncertain huff breaking the silence. The gesture was small, tentative, but Jack's chest ached with it, vision blurring hot and sudden. His hand moved on instinct, fingers brushing light and careful over the thick fur between Max's ears. For a heartbeat, Max stiffened, shoulders bunching tight, but then the tension melted by fractions, and he leaned, barely, hesitantly, into the touch. Jack's breath hitched, a broken sound catching in his throat. But he stayed still, fingers carding, slow and careful, through fur that was rough with old scars. Each pass a promise. "I'm here. I won't leave." Max's eyes fluttered, half-lidded but not glassy, the growl tapering into a low, breathy whine. Jack's thumb traced a scar along his ear, a pale line he recognized, one he'd cleaned and bandaged himself a lifetime ago, in a tent under desert stars. Rex's head heavy on his knee and eyes bright with pain, but never fear. The memory hit hard and fast, tearing the breath from Jack's chest, and his hands trembled with the force of it, guilt and grief tangling sharp and jagged. "I'm sorry," he choked, the words slipping raw and unbidden past numb lips. "God, I'm so sorry." Max's ears flicked, eyes cutting up to Jack's face, confused and searching. His head tilted, nose nudging Jack's palm, a soft, questioning whine that twisted the knife deeper. Jack's vision blurred, hot tears slipping unbidden down his cheeks, but he didn't pull back, didn't let go. "I should have found you," he rasped, voice splintering. I shouldn't have left. The words fractured, breaking under the weight of them, and Jack's shoulders shook, breath catching sharp and uneven. Max's nose bumped his wrist, a gentle nudge that sent fresh tears spilling, and his breath hitched, hands fisting in coarse fur. I'm sorry, Jack whispered again. The words a prayer, a confession, an apology that would never be enough. Max's eyes stayed steady, ears half tilted, and for a heartbeat, a breath, a flicker, his head pressed firmer into Jack's palm, a hesitant, cautious weight. Jack's heart stuttered, a broken sob catching in his throat, and he buried his face in the rough fur, fingers clutching tight. The rain pounded against the windows, a steady roar that muffled the sound of Jack's breathing, ragged and raw, and the living room blurred into shadow and stormlight. But Max stayed, didn't pull back or flinch, breath warm and slow against Jack's shoulder, eyes half closed and steady. Jack's hands ached with the grip, knuckles white and trembling, but he didn't let go. Couldn't, not when the weight of guilt and grief pressed so heavy against his chest it hurt to breathe. They stayed like that until the storm passed, the rain tapering into a soft patter and the thunder distant and dull. Jack's breath evened, shoulders slumping heavy with exhaustion, but his fingers stayed tangled in Max's fur, grip loose but steady. Max's eyes fluttered, dark lashes brushing his cheeks, but he didn't pull back, didn't move away, and Jack's heart ached with the weight of it, raw and bittersweet. The room was dark, shadows stretching long and quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't suffocate, just held them both, steady and unbroken, breath by breath. The woods behind Jack's house stretched dark and quiet, shadows draped heavy between pines, the underbrush thick with damp leaves and the crisp bite of autumn. The sun hung low, bleeding gold between branches, but the air was sharp with the promise of frost, stinging Jack's cheeks as he moved slowly down the narrow path. The leash was loose in his hand, trailing slack between him and Max, who padded ahead with ears perked, nose to the ground. His movements were careful, paws scuffing over wet leaves, but he didn't pull, didn't dart at every crack of a twig like he used to. Progress, Jack reminded himself, the word both a comfort and a weight, pressing heavy against the guilt lodged deep in his chest. Max's ears flicked back at the sound of Jack's boots crunching over roots, a soft huff leaving his muzzle. But his eyes stayed bright, a hint of curiosity sparking beneath the wariness that still lingered. Jack's chest ached at the sight, bittersweet and raw, but he forced his voice steady, coaxing. That's it, bud, he rasped, the words fogging faintly in the cold. Just a bit farther. They hadn't ventured this far from the house before, had barely made it past the fence on most days, Max's tail tucked tight and eyes flicking to every shadow, ears flat at the faintest rustle. But today he'd followed Jack to the edge of the trees without hesitation, paws shifting restlessly over gravel, ears swiveling to catch Jack's every breath. It had been weeks since the storm, since Max had pressed his head to Jack's shoulder and stayed there, breath warm and steady against Jack's neck, the weight of it enough to shatter what was left of Jack's composure. Weeks of slow mornings on the porch, coffee cooling in Jack's hands, and Max's eyes fixed on every passing car, every rustle in the grass. Weeks of Jack's hands buried in thick fur, careful and soft, murmured reassurances slipping past cracked lips, his heart aching with every hesitant lean into the touch. Progress, Jack reminded himself again, the word a mantra, a lifeline. Small steps, thread by thread, building something fragile and unsteady between them. The path narrowed, roots twisting up through mud, and Jack adjusted his grip on the leash, boots scuffing over damp moss. Max's ears flicked, nose twitching at the scent of wet bark and pine sap. But he stayed close, tail low but not tucked, eyes bright and wary. Jack's chest eased, breath unfurling slow and steady, and he risked a step closer, fingers brushing light against Max's shoulder. The contact was brief, tentative, but Max didn't flinch, just turned, ears tilting, eyes dark and searching. You're doing good, Jack murmured, voice hoarse, fingers curling tighter around the leash. Real good, bud. Max's ears dipped, a soft huff leaving his muzzle. But he took another step, nose to the ground, paws shifting through damp leaves with a cautious sort of purpose. Jack's chest ached, breath catching on the raw edge of it, but he followed, boots heavy and heartbeat louder than the wind through the pines. The old clearing came into view slowly, shadowed and overgrown, grass tall and silvered with frost, an old picnic table half buried beneath leaves and broken branches. The sight of it hit hard, breath stuttering in Jack's chest, boots faltering over roots. The last time he'd been here, Rex had been at his side, tongue lolling and ears perked, eyes bright with that familiar spark that eased the worst of Jack's nightmares, smoothed the jagged edges of memory. They'd spent hours here some days, throwing battered tennis balls until Jack's shoulder ached and Rex's sides heaved, paws churning up dirt and leaves and sprays of dust and sunlight. A lifetime ago, it felt like. Before the sand and the blood and the radio crackling with static, Rex's name breaking through the noise sharp and panicked. Before the dust cleared and the world narrowed to smoke, in twisted metal, and Rex gone, swallowed by chaos and fire and the roar of helicopters. Jack's fingers trembled, knuckles white around the leash, but he forced his legs to move, boots dragging through grass, stiff with frost. Max's ears perked, eyes cutting back to Jack's face, head tilting with a soft, confused huff, paws scuffing slow and uncertain. Jack swallowed, throat tight, and crouched slowly, knees creaking with the movement. "It's all right," he rasped, the words fractured and raw. "Come on, boy." Max hesitated, ears flicking, but inched forward, nose twitching at the damp ground. His eyes flicked to the old table, the leaves strewn thick across the rotting wood, and he paused, head dipping. His nostrils flared, a soft whine leaving his throat, and he took a step, tail swaying, slow and tentative. Jack's breath caught, fingers curling tight in the leash, and he stayed frozen, muscles locked against the ache swelling sharp and sudden in his chest. Max circled once, paws light and careful, ears swiveling to catch the faint rustle of wind in branches. His nose dipped to the ground, breath puffing soft against damp leaves, and for a heartbeat, a breath, a flicker, he seemed to pause, ears pricked and tail still. Then he moved forward, paws shifting over moss and dirt, and the leash pulled taut, a soft, questioning tug. Jack's hands shook, vision blurring hot and sudden. But he followed, boots heavy and unsteady over mud, breath shallow and ragged. Max stopped at the edge of the clearing, nose to the ground, ears flicking back with a low huff. Jack swallowed hard, throat raw, and sank to one knee, the leash slipping from his fingers. "You remember this place, bud?" he choked, voice cracked and splintering. "You used to love it here." Max's ears dipped, eyes lifting to Jack's face, and for a breath, a heartbeat, something flickered behind the amber, something bright and sharp and almost familiar. Jack's heart stuttered, breath catching, and he reached out, fingers trembling. Max's nose brushed his palm, light and warm, a soft huff leaving his throat, and Jack's breath broke, shoulders sagging. "You're still in there," he whispered, voice splintering at the edges. "I know you are." His fingers carted slow through thick fur, each pass a promise, and Max leaned in, eyes half-lidded, breath slow and even. For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth beneath Jack's hand, the steady weight of it, and the guilt eased, just a little, smoothed by the steady thrum of Max's heartbeat. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and cold between pines. But Jack stayed, knees digging into damp earth, breath fogging white. Max's eyes fluttered, lashes brushing dark against tan. But he didn't move away, didn't flinch. And as the light faded, gold bleeding to gray, Jack's eyes burned, vision blurring, but his hands stayed steady, fingers tangled in fur, and breath hitching slow and uneven. It wasn't enough, would never be enough to mend what was broken, to fix the years lost to sand and fire, and grief that hollowed deep and sharp. But for now, with Max's weight warm and solid against his chest, breath even and slow. It was enough. The sun hung low in a washed-out sky, light bleeding gold through the pines as Jack eased the truck down the gravel road, tires crunching over frost-crusted stones. The air was sharp, stinging through the open window, and pine needles swirled in slow spirals with each gust, scattering across the hood. Max lay sprawled in the passenger seat, ears half-perked and eyes drowsy, nose twitching faintly at every shift of wind. The leash was looped loosely through the seatbelt, more habit than necessity now, a precaution Jack hadn't yet found the courage to let go of. The radio crackled with static, a country song warbling low beneath the rumble of the engine, and Jack's fingers drummed absently over the wheel, nerves prickling sharp beneath his skin. His eyes cut sideways every few seconds, drawn to the rise and fall of Max's chest, to the way those familiar amber eyes slid half-closed and then fluttered open with each bump in the road. It had been months since the storm, months of slow mornings and quiet nights, of building trust in careful steps and halting words. Months of relearning how to breathe without it burning raw in his lungs, of coaxing Max from shadows with soft reassurances and outstretched palms. Jack's hands still trembled sometimes, voice catching on old memories and jagged edges. But the weight in his chest wasn't so crushing now, the silence less suffocating. Max shifted, a soft huff leaving his muzzle, eyes flicking to Jack's face with a slow blink, and Jack's breath caught, the ache dull but steady beneath his ribs. "Almost there, bud," he murmured, voice rasping in the cold. Max's ears flicked, nose dipping to nudge at Jack's wrist where it rested on the console, a warm puff of breath slipping over knuckles still raw from winter's chill. Jack's fingers twitched, heart stuttering at the gesture, and he scrubbed a hand over his face, breath shuddering. "Yeah," he choked, voice splintering. "You're right. We've got this." The road wound narrow through pines and barren fields, twisting up toward the old trailhead, where frost glittered silver over roots and branches hung low beneath the weight of half-melted snow. The truck lurched to a stop in the gravel lot, and Jack hesitated, hands white-knuckled around the wheel, breath fogging faintly in the cold. Max's head lifted, ears pricking at the sudden stillness, eyes sharp and questioning. Jack exhaled slow, the breath stuttering, uneven past cracked lips, and reached to unbuckle the leash with fingers that trembled. "All right," he rasped, throat tight. "Let's see what you remember." The door creaked open, cold air biting sharp, and Max's nose twitched, ears swiveling. For a moment, he stayed rooted to the seat, eyes darting to the trees and back to Jack's face, uncertain. But then his paws shifted, claws scuffing over leather, and he inched forward, a cautious step that pulled the leash taut. Jack stayed still, breath held tight, chest aching with the weight of it, but his hands stayed loose, voice low and coaxing. "Come on, bud," he murmured, forcing a smile that felt raw and splintered at the edges. "You're safe." Max's ears flicked, eyes narrowing, but he took another step, paws hitting gravel, nose lifting to scent the wind. His eyes flicked back, a soft huff leaving his throat, and for a breath, a heartbeat, he hesitated, weight shifting from paw to paw. But then he moved, tail swaying, slow and cautious, and Jack's chest eased, breath breaking in a shudder that he didn't bother to hide. "Good boy," he choked, voice cracking. "That's it." They moved slow up the trail, boots crunching over frost and paws light over damp moss. Sunlight cutting in thin, pale streams through pine branches. Max's nose dipped to the ground every few steps, ears flicking at every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig, but his tail stayed low and loose, eyes bright with curiosity beneath the wariness that still lingered. Jack kept the leash slack, fingers loose around nylon, breath clouding white with every exhale, nerves prickling sharp beneath his skin. The path wound narrow between roots and fallen branches, the trees stretching tall and bare, needles scattered thick over the ground, and the wind whispered low between trunks, stirring up the scent of damp earth and cedar. Memories pressed hard and sudden, raw and unrelenting, twisting up sharp beneath Jack's ribs. The way Rex used to dart ahead on these trails, ears perked and tail high. tongue lolling in a wide grin that eased the tightness in Jack's chest, smoothed the rough edges of memory with every bark and huff of warm breath. The way Rex's eyes used to cut back every few seconds, bright with a question and a challenge, a dare to keep up. The way those eyes had dimmed, fogged with confusion and pain, the last time Jack had seen them through a haze of smoke and sand. Jack's hands shook, knuckles white around the leash, but he forced his shoulders to stay loose, breath even. Max's ears flicked back, eyes darting to Jack's face, a soft huff leaving his throat. "Sorry," Jack rasped, voice splintering at the edges. "Didn't mean to spook you." Max's eyes narrowed, ears tilting with a soft whine. But he didn't pull away, just took a step closer, nose brushing light against Jack's wrist. Warm breath puffing soft and steady. Jack's breath stuttered, throat closing, but his fingers carted slow and careful through thick fur. A promise. "I'm here. I've got you." Max leaned in, eyes half-lidded, breath even, and Jack's eyes burned, vision blurring hot and sudden. "Good boy," he choked, voice raw. "That's my good boy." They stayed like that until the shadows stretched long between the trees, light bleeding gold and gray through branches. The air was cold, biting with the promise of frost, but Jack's hands stayed steady, fingers buried in fur and breath unfurling, slow and even. When Max pulled back, eyes bright and ears perked, tail swaying slow, Jack's chest eased, breath catching in a weak, fractured laugh. "Ready to go home, bud," he rasped, voice cracked and unsteady. Max's ears flicked, a soft huff leaving his muzzle, and he took a step, nose dipping to nudge at Jack's knee, a gentle push that felt like trust. Jack's heart stuttered, breath breaking, but he forced a smile, forced his voice steady. "All right," he choked, leash loose in his hand. "Let's go." The path wound back down between pines and cedar, shadows pooling thick and dark, the truck a dull glint through branches. Max moved ahead, ears perked, eyes bright with a spark that hadn't been there in months, tail low but not tucked. Jack's chest ached with it, the weight of it bittersweet and raw, but his hands stayed steady, breath slow and even, each step a thread in something fragile and unsteady, but real. The truck door creaked, and Max hesitated, eyes flicking to the trees and back to Jack's face, a question in the tilt of his head. Jack's fingers twitched, heart pounding loud in his ears, but he forced a smile, voice soft. "Yeah, bud," he whispered, throat tight. "We're going home." Max's ears flicked, nose dipping with a soft huff, and he jumped into the cab, eyes bright and amber, warm and steady. Jack slid behind the wheel, hands white-knuckled but breath even, heart pounding hard and aching beneath his ribs. The road stretched long and dark ahead, pines blurring in the headlights. But Max's eyes stayed fixed on Jack's face, bright and unwavering. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't flinch from the weight of it, just breathed, slow and even, and drove toward the light. In the end, this story wasn't just about a soldier and his loyal companion. It was about the power of perseverance, trust, and the courage it takes to rebuild what's been broken. Jack's journey with Max showed us that true healing isn't about forgetting the past, but learning to live with it, one small step at a time. Through patience and unwavering love, Jack reminded us that the bonds we form with those we care about can survive even the darkest of trials. It's a testament to how, with time and kindness, even the deepest wounds can begin to mend. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human and animal spirit. Your support helps us keep telling these stories of courage and connection. Until next time, take care and hold on to hope.